What's up, everyone? We are going to the studio today. This is my dried gouache palette, and I've been using it for well over 4 months. I thought it would be a good time to give you guys an update about how it's been going, the pros and cons, and maybe some tips that will help you if you're trying to maintain a dried gouache palette or just want to try it if you haven't yet. I'll be painting a location I experienced recently on a big bike trip, which I have a whole other video series about on my other channel, but it was a beautiful place with so much inspiration, and you know I love rocks. Let's first take a look at one of my small dried gouache palettes that I haven't touched in over 4 months and see if we can reactivate it. If you haven't seen this little guy before, I'll put a link in the description to my previous videos about using dried gouache and how I set up my palettes. As you can see, the gouache is completely dry and cracked and probably contains no moisture anymore, but that doesn't mean it's useless. Adding a little water will allow me to use it. At first it will be a little more transparent, but as the water soaks in, it becomes more normal and opaque. Certain colors are always going to be a little drier, like cobalt blue. Certain colors are always going to be a little more transparent, like phthalos and quinacridones. Certain colors are always going to be extremely opaque, like cadmiums, or earth tones like ochres. What I love about dried gouache palettes is how carefree I can be with them. Previously, I kept a wet gouache palette, and I have dozens of videos about using those, but it was a lot more maintenance and a lot more work to keep it clean and fresh and avoid the dreaded palette mold. Ew. But now I simply spray the gouache before closing the palette, and as you can see, even if I don't touch it for many months, it's still usable. I love that convenience of just not even having to think about it. Now let's take a look at my main dried gouache palette, which has changed a little since you saw it last time. But first I want to let you know that this video is sponsored by my Patreons. Every single month I post at least 2 tutorials, plus reference photos and behind the scenes and sketchbook scans. In particular, I've been enjoying making my Behind the Brush series, which dives deeper into concepts behind the painting, like why I do what I do, and ways that you can improve as an artist that are not just necessarily about techniques. And I want to say a massive thank you to all of you who support me on Patreon. It's the main way I'm able to keep doing this for a living. Thank you all so much. So back to my main dried gouache palette. This is the one I take outside with me often, so I use it a few times a month. Doing so helps keep it fresh, and I really don't have to deal with it drying too much or getting crumbly, except for this recent July where I was going hard on the watercolor and I just let this one sit there. I had to refresh some of the colors, and I also noticed that if I let some of the colors run really low, they will dry faster. And those are the ones that tend to crumble. So one of the best tips I have is to keep the paint a little bit more full in the pans. And in a way that encourages me to use it more often too. Sometimes if I let the colors run low and I think about having to refresh the palette, I just will put it off and use watercolor instead. So I'm trying to get into the habit of topping up my colors like once a month, and that really seems to be helping. What I'm doing here is just cleaning the edges, which get really gunked up because I paint so quickly and I'm constantly changing or dipping my brush into the different colors. They get cross-contaminated pretty quickly. This is what my palette usually looks like after a painting. Yikes. Okay, I think it's time for a paint session. As I mentioned, I want to paint one of the locations I recently experienced on my bike journey. It's a beautiful coastal area with all sorts of dramatic cliffs, and in particular, I'm painting the Bullers of Buchan, which is a huge collapsed sea cave. Let me just show you. this. This is a massive collapsed sea cave. Imagine back in the day, you could just walk across and get to that point. Now, boom, gone. Which is kind of scary if you think about it. Like, I'm standing here. This could collapse at any time. Then again, we could all fall into a sinkhole at any point in our life. So this is gonna be my first painting or sketching spot of the day. I really wanted to paint while I was there, but I had about 20 miles to go that day and I thought it was going to rain. So I stuck to a sketch. And what I tried to focus on in the sketch is just establishing the shadow areas, because I often get a little confused about values in caves, and whenever there's like a sea arch and there's light bouncing around on the rocks. So what I've been practicing a lot, or studying a lot, is where the darkest darks are and the brightest brights. So that's also why when I paint it, I start with the brightest brights, because once I know where that is, then I can figure out my darker areas. And at first, I'm always tempted to make the shadows on the rocks the darkest, but more often than not, it's the color or the value of the water that's a lot darker than the rocks, because light sort of just sinks through the water. It reflects what's around it. The rocks themselves bounce a lot of light around, and usually there's a lot more color and light visible on the rocks. So that's just a little tip I've picked up. And in terms of color, you could really use anything. As long as you get the values right, it'll make sense. Hopefully by now you can see how well the dried gouache performs, especially on toned paper where transparency wouldn't work very well. All it takes is a little water, let it sink into the gouache for a little bit, and it's good to go. So yeah, from now on you can consider me a dried gouache convert, when it comes to painting outside at least. I will often use wet gouache fresh from the tube in the studio, especially when I'm using a limited palette, which is actually all the time nowadays. But yeah, I'm done with my wet gouache palette outside. It's just too much of a faff and I don't want to deal with it anymore. So from now on, when you see me outside, you'll be seeing this palette. It just suits the way I like to travel and paint, so it's perfect for an artist like me. Big